As long as I can remember, I've had a serious sweet tooth. Today I'll be demonstrating how to make one of my favorite desserts, a pumpkin roll. It's not the easiest dessert to make, however, I have some tips and tricks to make the perfect roll every single time. It takes a bit of work, but it will be worth it. So the first thing you're going to want to do, anytime you're cooking, is wash your hands. So that's what I'll be doing. You're also going to want to preheat your oven to 375 degrees while you're preparing your ingredients. I have already done so. Then we need to collect our ingredients in our bakeware. For your bakeware, you're going to want 2 large mixing bowls, a whisk, at least 1 spatula. You can use a hand mixer. I'll be using a stand mixer today. I think it's a lot easier to make the icing when we get there. But for at least the cake portion, we can be using a whisk. It'll be much easier that way. For our ingredients for our cake, we have 2/3 of a cup of pureed pumpkin, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 3 eggs, 1 cup of sugar, and 3/4 of a cup of flour. So first, we are going to add our eggs. And we will beat these eggs. Next, we can add our sugar, our cinnamon, our baking soda, and our pumpkin. We're going to mix these all thoroughly. The reason we're not adding in the flour yet is because we're going to want to do that 1/3 of a cup at a time. If you add in the flour all at once, you're much more likely to get chunks in your batter, and it won't cook evenly. So we're going to mix this. It's going to have a more runny consistency than most cake batters, but that is okay. That's what we're looking for. So we're just going to mix this all up until it's nice and smooth, and then we can begin to add our flour mix. Like I said, you want to do this about 1/3 of a cup at a time, half to 1/3 of a cup at a time. It doesn't really matter. We just want it to be smooth. A little bit more. Like I said, you can use a stand mixer for this, you can use a whisk, you can use a hand mixer. It doesn't really matter. As long as the batter is smooth and consistent, it will cook properly. The rest of our flour. Like I said, this is not going to be quite as thick as a traditional cake mix, so don't worry if it seems a little bit runny. Should be about good. This is going to be the consistency that you're looking for. Like I said, it is going to be a little bit more runny. Next, you're going to take a 9x13 baking sheet and cover it with parchment paper. If you don't have parchment paper, you can grease the cookie sheet very well, but I think it's a lot easier to use the parchment paper. Take your spatula. This part's pretty important because if the batter is not spread evenly across the tray, you're more likely to get holes and tears in the cake when you go to roll it. And that's a really important part. You don't want to rip your cake. So we want to make sure it's spread nice and even across the baking tray. And with the parchment paper, it's not necessary that it's a perfect fit to the tray. As long as it covers it completely, you'll be perfectly fine. Nice and even. You can always give the tray a little gentle shake just to make sure it's spread evenly. That looks good. And we're going to pop it in the oven in the middle rack for 15 to 20 minutes. All right. So here I have a cake that I prepared earlier. This one has been baked. As you can see, it should have a springy kind of spongy texture to it when it's finished. You want to make sure there's no real brown on it. If it's turning brown, it's going to be overcooked, and that will crack as well when you try to roll it. So you want to make sure you keep a really careful eye on the cake while it's baking, because it's very easy to overbake it. So we're going to take this cake, and we're just going to trim the edges just a little bit, just to make it look a little bit nicer. This part isn't completely necessary, but it definitely makes the cake look a little bit more presentable if you're, going to be gifting it or taking it anywhere. I like to make these for Thanksgiving. All right, so we can trim that up. That's going to be ready to ice. So we can prepare the icing now. For the icing, we have 3/4 cup of sugar, 4 ounces of butter, and 8 ounces of cream cheese. You're going to want to make sure you soften your butter beforehand. It's very difficult to mix it if the butter's not softened. It's going to make lumpy icing. Like I said before, I like to use a stand mixer when I'm making my icing. The cream cheese is just really thick and it can be difficult to mix by hand, so it's a lot more convenient if you have a stand mixer. At this point as well, you take your cake out of the oven, you can trim it up. We're going to want to roll the cake at this point. This can be a little bit tricky. This is the most difficult part, I believe. Alright. So to roll the cake, we're going to start very slowly at one end, and just very slowly roll it up. You don't want it to be too tight. You don't want the cake to rip in the process. Alright, that should look something like this. It's not frosted yet, but we're going to pop it in the refrigerator and let it cool completely before we frost it. If you frost it while it's still warm, the icing can melt and it'll just ooze everywhere. So we're going to pop this in the fridge. And we just need to mix our frosting a little bit more. Like I said, it is fairly thick, so it might take a little bit to kind of get the consistency that you're looking for. That looks great. The cream cheese frosting is going to be fairly thick. Once your cake is completely cool, you can take it out of the refrigerator. The one I prepared earlier had cooled down a little bit, so I don't need to leave it in there quite as long. Alright, so just gently, carefully unroll the cake. Gonna make sure it's completely cool. Like I said, you don't want your frosting to melt. And we can begin to ice it. Nice even strokes with the frosting. Gonna want to make sure you completely cover it. This part's always a little bit nerve-wracking for me because, you know, you can still rip the cake with the frosting, but if you're too aggressive with it, so you want to be gentle. Oops. Get the corners. There we are. Now, we're gonna slightly separate the cake from the parchment paper. It shouldn't stick. It doesn't tend to stick. And we are slowly going to roll this one more time. Just like so. I do need to trim this one up a little bit, but I have one I prepared earlier that I trimmed and is ready to go. So then you're just going to want to simply trim the edges off of the cake, and this will be your finished product. I hope you enjoyed as much as I do.